Cubic unit cells. By the end of this topic, you should be able to draw unit cells for each of the cubic crystal systems: primitive, body-centered and face-centered. Introduction into cubic unit cells. Taking one of the 7 crystal systems, we shall start with the cubic crystal system, which essentially begins as a cube. All sides of the cube are of the same length, so A equals B, which equals C. We shall now see how to arrange atoms within a cubic crystal system. There are 3 main ways to arrange the atoms in a cubic crystal system. Firstly, we shall start off with the simplest. This is the primitive cubic unit cell, where each of the atoms are placed onto the corners of the cube. We shall now look at a body-centered cubic unit cell. This is where all of the atoms are placed on the corners of the cube, as in a primitive cubic unit cell. However, there is now one atom placed in the centre of the cell. This is called a body-centered cubic unit cell. The last and final way of arranging the atoms in a cubic crystal system is in a face-centered cubic unit cell. This is where there is an atom on each of the corners, just as in a primitive unit cell. However, now there is also one atom on each of the faces of the cubic unit cell. These atoms are highlighted in red on the diagram. Please note that there is no atom in the centre of the cell, as in body-centered unit cells. In order to turn a 3D crystal structure into a 2D form, we can use a technique called a projection drawing. We can think of the cube as having different levels, 0, 1/2 and 1, and the atoms then can occupy these different levels, as we shall see on the next slide for a primitive cubic unit cell. The atoms then fill each of these different levels, the 0, 1/2 and a 1, and an example of this is a primitive unit cell. So we fill all of the atoms onto each of the corners of the cube, and we can see that only the atoms in the 0 and the 1 levels actually fill up. To then form this 3D structure into a 2D projection, we look as though we are looking down on the 3D structure from above. We can then form a square and then show the 3D structure in a 2D form. So we put each of the atoms onto the corners of the cell for a primitive unit cell, and then we label it with a number 0, 1 to show the different levels that the atoms were on. The next few slides shall show projection drawings for primitive, body-centered cubic and face-centered cubic. As we have seen before, this primitive unit cell has atoms in the levels 0 and 1, which then form a projection drawing with each of the atoms on the corner of the square and a label of 0 and 1 to show that it was on those different levels. Now, in order to do a body-centered cubic, it is slightly different from a primitive unit cell, where the atoms now fill the levels 0, 1/2 and a 1. This is shown in a projection drawing by placing an atom in the centre of the square and labelling it with the label 1/2. Each of the atoms on the corners are still at the levels 0 and 1 as in a primitive unit cell. Now going from the body-centred cubic into the face-centred cubic, the atom in the centre of the cell now disappears and we instead have atoms on each of the faces of the cube as seen before. These then fill the levels 0, 1/2 and 1, just as seen before in the primitive and the body-centred cubic unit cells. To then see this as a projection drawing is slightly more complicated than the other two. However, if we break it into stages, firstly we have all of the atoms on the corners of the cube. These are shown just as in a primitive unit cell on the corners of the square and given the label 0 and 1. These are labelled in an orange colour here. Secondly, we shall see the atom that was in the centre for a body-centred cube is now instead on both of the faces above and below of the cube. This then occupies the centre of the square as seen in the projection drawing, and now instead of having a label of 1/2 now has a label of 0 and 1 as it is on each of the faces of the cube instead of being in the centre of the cube. And then lastly, for the last 4 faces of the cube which surround the cube if we look around it, these atoms are placed onto the edges of the square between the atoms that are on the corners of the square. And these are highlighted here in green and are given the label 1/2 as they occupy the half level.